Welcome folks, you are listening to the A Minute to Midnight show. My name's Tony. Today on the show I have Lynette Zang, and she provides some very interesting answers to what's going on in the global financial system and some practical solutions as to what you can do to help yourself get through what's coming. I want to welcome Lynette Zang to the A Minute to Midnight show. It's the first time we've had you on our show, Lynette, but I know we've had listeners saying you've got to get Lynette on the show for a while, and I'd had the same thought, so it's great to be chatting to you today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Tony. Thank you so much for having me on. New Zealand is really a special place for me, actually.
Yeah, well, we're just saying off air, and I was saying you definitely want to come here, but just choose the right time of year, and it's a really lovely place to come, and it's not this time of year.
Yeah, but the reason why it's a special place, it has a special place in my heart, is because New Zealand's actually the reason why I understand as much as I do about currencies. When I was a new stockbroker back, that would have been probably in 87. Yeah, in about 87, I stumbled across non-dollar denominated bonds, and I fell in love with the New Zealand bonds. So I had to learn about the politics and the economics and how the currencies moved. But had I not stumbled across, and I did some in Australia and Canada as well, but most of what I did was with New Zealand bonds. And so every day, I'd go home and I'd study about the politics and what was going on there. And then I'd have conversation with the head of currency trading at Shearson in the morning. But that's when I fell in love with New Zealand. So I'm very happy to be here.
That sounds good. And you have been in this game for a long time too. So perhaps you could just give the listeners that don't know who you are, and I know a heck of a lot of them do, but some probably won't. Can you just give them a brief background?
Oh, sure. Because actually, I've been groomed for this moment in time. And on some level, I've been in these markets since 1964 because my uncle was a major antique dealer and he had a lot of gold coins. And then I've been a banker and I've been a stockbroker. I studied business finance. And I came here to ITM Trading in 2002, and I built all of the databases to track all of the different asset classes, and also actually to execute a strategy that I developed, because of what I learned from doing the non-dollar denominated New Zealand bonds. So yeah, I have a very long background in this.
That's good, and yes, you mentioned the ITM Trading, and at the end we've had 3 or 4 questions that listeners have said I've got to ask Lynette, and they tend to be related to gold and silver. So towards the end, hopefully we'll get to be able to ask you those questions. And meantime, we've got quite a lot of other stuff to cover as well. And the first thing I saw you do, well, I was researching a bit into the whole AC chain or ACK chain and the blockchain and what's going on there, and I came across a video that you'd done. I'd already watched you doing other stuff, but I happened to come across this, and you got into it. Yeah, quite a bit anyway. So I thought, well, I've definitely got to ask you about this because I was looking at, doing something on it. Because I find it quite, to be honest, a scary concept that's getting potentially everyone basically entrenched and fenced into a system that will basically be global. So what are your thoughts on that? What is it first for the people who don't know?
Well, basically, the problem that we're dealing with is that the current financial system, which is based on never-ending debt and compounding interest, is at an end. And so they need a new system to shift us into. And essentially, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has a currency called the SDR that was created back in '69, but has essentially been sleeping really up until the crisis happened in 2008. They tested all the mechanisms, and so they've been tweaking the system. But I'm quite convinced that that will be the next world reserve currency. In 2011, they basically brought out a template of how they would introduce it globally. And one of the key pieces in that template, and I can send you the links on that too, Megan, if you would just make a note of that, and I'll send you that link. But one of the key pieces in that template were for all assets to be valued in terms of SDRs. Right now, and since 1948, and that's really what the world reserve currency means for those listeners that aren't aware of it. It means that if you are a government or a corporation or an individual going outside of your borders to buy anything, you have to do it with US dollars. Now, we know that's actually been changing since 2005, but between 1948 and 2005, that's how it was. So, but the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is all of its members are either, they are Treasury secretaries and central bank chiefs, so unelected officials. They want to control the world reserve currency. So, now they have to create a market for it. Okay, fine. But when I saw AC coin and AC chain, there were a few things that caught my attention with it. Number one, the whole premise of it is to hold title to all physical assets. I mean, every single physical asset on the planet. So it could even be, the shirt on your back or the car that you drive, the house that you live in, etc. And then also what caught my attention with that is how the title is then married to a Visa or a MasterCard and broken down into tiny bite-sized pieces so that it is easy for you to spend your equity. You wouldn't have to go to the bank to get a loan on the equity on your house, which takes a little more effort, though lots of people do that. No, you just have it on your phone, right, wherever you go, and makes it very, very easy to spend your equity. But if you take either Bitcoin or Ethereum and you buy AC coin with it, it magically becomes an SDR, which is the IMF's internal currency. And SDR just stands for special drawing rights. It's just a name. Just like the New Zealand dollar is a name, the US dollar is a name, it's just a name. It doesn't really mean anything, and it's not a claim against anything. But that's what those two pieces, I have not come across any other cryptocurrencies that turn into an SDR. They are out of China, and China has been tasked with developing the market for SDRs the U.S. had to agree, and the IMF made a lot of changes so that the Chinese yuan could be a component of the SDR, because that's a basket of fiat currencies. So that's really what got my attention about the AC chain and the AC coin, was the fact that it holds title. It can be broken down into itty-bitty pieces, making it really easy for people to spend, but it turns into an SDR. That means the IMF has the title. If they get away with all of it, then they would have the title, control the title to every single physical asset on this planet.
And what really interested me was in one of the videos they put out was how they were touting it as the fulfillment of the 1988 Rothschild Economist magazine cover, which I've covered many times on the show. And how they were talking about a new global currency around 2018, and they pitched that video as saying this is it. And
Yes.
I know, I mean, there are people that say, oh, the Chinese and the Russians are against the Rothschilds and all that. My research says no, the Rothschilds have been moving into China for, well, since at least 2005 pretty seriously. So I would not be surprised if their hands are actually in this whole thing. But one thing that I came across, I'm just going to read a little bit, was written by Serena Lin, who is the spokesman for AC Chain. And she said,
Yep.
AC Coin is perhaps the best kept secret in the digital world, suggests Lin, representing years of work initiated even before the launch of Bitcoin. AC Coin was designed and configured complete with its own ecosystem to be the premier anchoring or digitizing token on the planet. It has the ability to convert and later reconstitute both tangible and intangible assets to and from the digital universe, and so on. And it's like, wow, see, this is not something that's just sprung up off the
No.
block. This has been in the planning for a long time. And it ties in with the other thing, which is the International Digital Assets Council, which they also advertise in their video. And I've looked into, okay, who are the people behind that? And two names that on their website, Eric van der Kledge, I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name, but he was a former CTO of Tech City UK initiative for Prime Minister David Cameron and chairman of advisory group to the UK government. So he is, well, it's Britain for a start. And then the other guy also has ties to Britain. Yeah, exactly. And that's David White. And he was Royal Bank of Scotland head of technology innovation and was, I think, 8 or 9 years there. And in 2017, he was the host of CogX, which was touted as the festival of all things AI, blockchain, and emerging technologies. So these guys are, big players with government, having worked for the government and government-associated banks, and major ties into the artificial intelligence thing, which is also a very scary field, in my opinion.
The thing about all of this, I can see some good in the blockchain technology and in the artificial intelligence. Yes, both of those things can do some good. But I can also see the other side of it, and that's the loss of control and the loss of freedom and rights. Because of everything, or I should say when everything is digital, if that's where all of your wealth is, if you have all of your assets looped into that system, whether it's, a car that can drive away if you don't make the payment or you don't pay your taxes on it or what have you, or a house that can lock you out of, or a refrigerator that can order what you're going to eat. I mean, these are not things that I want in my personal life. And so, yeah, it is scary. It is scary, but there is also opportunities that present, and where my personal focus is on that transitional side, because this is the fourth industrial revolution. The world is going to look very, very different in 10 years than it does today, because I think that in 10 years, we are likely to be, if not fully into that transition into a new financial system and a new currency system, I think we'll probably be fairly close, because we're very close to we've already begun to enter it. We haven't gone into the crisis phase yet, but I don't think we're very far from that at all. And that takes us to the LIBOR, what's going to push that over, because there are a lot of things that could push it over. But there's also a lot of things that happen during these transition, and I'm seeing these things occurring. Like, there is always, in all my studies of currency life cycles, there is always a war. Well, we've been in a perpetual state of war since '89, but, look at what's happening in the Middle East, in North Korea. I mean, there's a hotbed. So there's always a war to distract you. And interestingly enough, there also seem to be some socio changes that take place, like going back to 71 or even the turn of the century. Well, we had the suffragette movement in 1914, when we also had World War I. In 71, we had the women's lib movement. We also had the civil rights movement, and it kind of seems like we've got some of those same movements going on. Globally, we have the Me Too movement, which is a woman's movement, and look at what's been happening with, at least in this country, with Black people at Starbucks getting kicked out, or in Airbnb, and right. So I think that piece is also ratcheting up, which I just find really interesting. Then you also always have a major market implosion, and you also have an extreme, if not hyper level of hyperinflation. And then that shifts in, and people are so bloodied and bruised by the time all of these different things happen, and they're distracted, right? And they shift us from one kind of currency into another, but they always keep the name the same, because then people don't realize that anything has changed, when in reality, everything has changed. It's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think the whole war thing is, I mean, obviously that's a big one to watch at the moment. And yeah, it's a good distraction if they can have a big war for changing over. Well, if the whole financial system, I say if the whole financial system is falling apart, I think it was designed to implode, to be honest. I don't think it's an accident. It was put in place deliberately for this to happen. And so whilst that's falling apart, all these other things can be a distraction, and also something to blame
and an
it on.
excuse.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's interesting though. I know there were people talking at both ends. Some was saying, "Oh, what we're going to see is deflation. There's going to be a depression and a deflation," and other people were saying, "No, we're going to see hyperinflation." But what appears to be happening is some sort of like stagflation, where at this point anyway, I think, where prices of some things are going up, like housing prices and rents are crazy, and then but people's income is not. So it's only happening. The gap's widening.
Well, yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that too is by design, because what they knew, and maybe we should back up here a little bit to move forward, because what I find is, generally speaking, people don't really understand money. I mean, we all work for it. Yeah. We use it as our tool of barter. We attempt to save it. We attempt to invest it, but we don't really understand it. And so, going back, they needed a tool to value labor and then hold any excess labor that we generate today that we didn't need to use for use in the future. And the goal was for it to have the same level of purchasing power, the same value, so that you are always fairly valued for your labor, no matter when you use the money. Well, they tried many different things over the years, but only gold actually meets all the criteria. And its most important function is to hold your purchasing power, hold your value intact over time. But the problem for governments is that then when they want to tax you, it's a visible tax, and you might not agree to it. Plus, when we were on the gold standard, meaning that you could convert your paper money into physical gold and pull it out of the system. If you didn't like what the governments were doing, that was a really easy way for you to vote and let them know, because gold creates fiscal responsibility. So they transitioned us into a fiat system. And that means by decree. So that's government-based, government-decreed money, which means they can also say it's no longer money. If they say, oh, this is money, and we saw that in India, and we saw that in Venezuela, we've seen it many, many places. Oh, this is not money anymore. You can't use it. Whereas gold and silver as well are universal tools of barter that are finite in nature. Gold is indestructible. And so, it holds its value over time. But inflation, you made the comment that you think this was all planned. Absolutely, 100%. Because inflation is not a monetary phenomenon. It is a fiat money phenomenon because it is a way for the government to tax you without having to make it visible, without going to Congress or making it visible that they're raising the taxes. The central banks simply creates more inflation via, interest rates. They want more inflation, they drop interest rates down, people borrow and spend. That pushes prices higher because there's more money chasing goods and services. And then when it gets overheated and people start screaming, they simply raise interest rates up, and that depresses borrowing and spending. And that's really the genius of this system and why they've been able to keep it going so long, because that wasn't the case prior to this. But we're anchored at zero, right? 90% of the industrialized world is anchored somewhere near zero interest rates. So now we've got negative rates, which has never happened before historically, because it doesn't make sense. But it is a telling sign that the system is dead. And it absolutely, I stand by this 100%. And I can prove it with my charts and my graphs. You can see it so clearly. It died in 2008.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. And it's just been a slow march to the crematorium or the cemetery for the financial system, and much slower than what we expected, I think.
Well, they had to create the new system to transition us into.
Yeah.
I personally do not think it was an accident that Bitcoin came out in March or April of 2009, right when the Federal Reserve started all that hyperinflationary QE money printing. So you also said some people say deflation, inflation, but what you need to understand is that the assets have been deflating. The stock markets, the bond markets, that's what happened in 2008. The stock markets, the bond markets, the real estate markets were dropping. They were deflating. Well, there's only one way, not like you have a whole bunch of choices, one way to fight deflation, and that is with inflation. The arrogance is that they think they can control it. The surprise is that they've managed to keep it hidden this long with all that hyperinflationary money printing. I mean, when you see a graph that goes straight up, that's hyperinflationary. But where did all that inflation go? Stocks, bonds, and real estate, the reflation trade. So we have both. You're right. It is stagflation, because what they never talk about really or much, or they take out food and energy and garbage, is the cost of living has not gotten cheaper. It has not gone down since 2008, even if the stock market prices had. Doesn't matter, right? Your cost of living has gone up.
That's interesting. And it brings to mind actually something I heard Evelyn de Rothschild, head of the Rothschild family, say on an interview at one point, saying the stock market is not a real reflection on a country's economy. Well, basically, and isn't that, I mean, I know that guy's been in control of a lot of the financial system, but he knows, and isn't that the truth? We've seen the stock market going sky high, and that's used as a benchmark to say, oh, the economies are doing really well because the stock market's up. But it's actually not a real reflection of the real economy, is it?
No, and that's that really is a function of perception management and nominal confusion, and which are their words and their terms, meaning central banks and governments. Those are not, mine, but it works really well. That nominal confusion piece, they knew that inflation created that. So if you had a $20 bill 10 years ago and you have a $20 bill today, nominally, they are identical. But what you could buy with that $20 bill 10 years ago is vastly different than what you can buy with it today. So people see the stock market going up in nominal terms, okay? But they also know that every time they go out to buy something, it takes more and more dollars to buy the same goods. So the value of the dollar is going down. And that's true wherever you are in the world, whether it's the New Zealand dollar or the US dollar or Australian dollar or any of them.
And of course, it's even worse in places like Venezuela, where their money basically become worthless.
Well, they're just a little ahead of us. I mean, we should be paying attention to what's happening in Venezuela so that we can be prepared, because really, if you stop and think about it, the money system is based on never-ending compounding debt. And when you have never-ending compounding debt, you have never-ending compounding interest. Okay? Well, if this debt is not payable, and if I did a study, I think like 2008 or 9, on because I looked at where the U.S. was, and I said, well, wait a minute. I looked at the deficits, and since 1971, we had accumulated roughly $1 trillion worth of deficits. Most of that since 2008 by a wide margin. And I said to myself, well, if we, and forgive me on the only part here, but if we only overspent $1 trillion more than what the government had coming in at that time, I said, why are we servicing 13 trillion in debt if we've only overspent 1 trillion? And, on all of those or many of the government sites, you can actually go in and get the raw data, even when you're looking at the graphs. So I pulled the raw data, and I had an accountant friend of mine look at it to make sure that I was accurate, because I am not an accountant. And he said that I was. And at that time, even though this is never the way that it's reported, 77% of the debt that the U.S. was servicing was compounding interest, because they were not paying all of the interest, right? They might say, oh, the interest this year is 500 billion or whatever the number is that they're going to throw out there. And we pay 400 of it. That means 100 of it goes into the principal. So they never really report on how much interest we're really servicing or is part of our debt. But if you're running a deficit, that means you are not paying all of your interest, let alone any of your principal.
And
so in a government, yeah, go ahead.
It's not. It can't just go away. It's all got to be going somewhere. All this debt.
Exactly. And when you can't repay the debt, what do you typically do? You declare bankruptcy. At some point, you declare bankruptcy.
Unless you're a government.
Even as a government, but the way the government does it is via hyperinflation, where they then, and this is part of the strategy, where they then repay those debts with a currency that has zero value. So, for example, a mortgage, okay? So think about it. If you took that mortgage out, say 10 years ago, whatever, and maybe you maxed out what you could do. Well, in theory, you're supposed to get raises along the way, so your mortgage is fixed, but your nominal interest goes up, making it easier to service that debt. But if that's a fixed rate contract, when they reset the currency like we just saw in Venezuela last February. When they reset the currency, they do it against gold. So in Venezuela, it went up over 2,600 times. But your mortgage, as a fixed contract, and I'm going to be talking about this in the fourth part of the series I'm doing on hyperinflation. I'm going to do it after I get back from New York, though, because that's a big one. But and I want to spend enough time in it to explain and show everybody really what happens in that regard. But your mortgage is fixed, at least for a certain period of time, till the bank gives you notification. If you have gold, since that's how a reset is performed, the gold goes up in terms of the currency. You capture those gains and you pay off your mortgage with New Zealand dollars that have zero value. But you got to have the gold in order to be able to do that. Most people don't. So they lose their property because the whole system resets.
Okay, now what about, I noticed that Putin on his re-inauguration the other day was talking about the fact that they need to get Russia away from oil in the US dollars. Basically, that it's, well, paraphrasing it, it's a drag and a drain on the Russian economy. So what does that actually mean, in terms of, is this an orchestrated plan that everyone is part of, and that this is kind of an excuse that Russia and China are getting away from the US dollar, or is that a global plan that everyone's part of? What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, let's think about this for a minute, okay? Because actually, pretty sure it was May of 2005, Russia announced, and Russia was really the one that could do this. They announced that from there forward, none of their assets would be valued in terms of dollars. From there forward, they would be valued in terms of euros, rubles, or gold. Now, unfortunately, I was not as sophisticated with screen capture and all that stuff then as I am today. But Russia was the one that really started the shift away from valuing global assets in terms of dollars. So that's number one. Number two, it really is the bankers that are driving this whole bus. It's not the politicians. So when you look at the International Monetary Fund, there are 196 countries in the world. 189 of them are members of the IMF. So again, that's every Treasury Secretary, every central bank chief that are meeting, and they're all above the law, by the way. They don't pay taxes anywhere. They're all meeting constantly to determine all of these policies. So I'm pretty sure, and have we not heard about the synchronized global recovery? And I have reports from government agencies like the CFTC and others that actually state in a number of those reports the synchronized activity of central bankers. So when you take into consideration that they're really the ones that are driving this whole bus and shifting us into the new system, I would say that it's a globally coordinated effort, because we didn't even try to stop China from entering that basket of currencies. We knew that our term, and here in the US, we knew that our time as the world reserve currency was over. We tried to give it back to them in 71, actually. That's why the SDR was created. So no, I don't think there's any them, or us and this conflict. And I think it's a globally coordinated plan myself. That's my opinion. I can't absolutely prove that one, but from the data that I look at, that's what I see.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's no real East versus West when it comes to the financial world at all. It's all controlled by the same few people. So how long is it going to be, do you think, until things really fall over?
Well, I think we're really close, and there are several reasons why I say that. Number one, and this is a big one, is that the big, huge bets, the derivatives that are in the banking system are not payable. And you have Deutsche Bank. I recently went through their financial statement. I did a video on their financial statement. And in that, they say that they have a leverage ratio of 3.8%. Now, that doesn't sound bad, except that what that means is that, and I could be off a little bit since I don't have this in front of me, but it took $27 worth of debt to generate $1 worth of equity. So if their equity, the value of their assets, fall more than 3.8%, they are actually insolvent. In that same report, they said that the value of their assets in a one-way up market had dropped in 2017 7%. So make no mistake, according to Deutsche Bank themselves, they are insolvent, and according to the IMF, they are the most dangerous global universal bank on the planet because in some way they touch every single financial institution and every single financial product on the planet. So what we have is a system of zombie banks that are already insolvent, but they have to be kept alive because if Deutsche Bank goes down, the system goes down, and they don't appear to be quite ready yet to shift us into the new system. So that's number one. Number two, the mechanism that most likely will push us over there is the LIBOR. Now, keep in mind, okay, banks know debt and leverage. And in 97, well, at least in this country, but I'm pretty sure that I could say this true globally, but I know for sure in this country, according to the Federal Reserve, we hit peak debt in 97. What do banks know? They know debt and leverage. So it was during that period of time and subsequent to that period of time when speculative derivative bets really were hot and heavy. Now that almost killed the system in 98 with long-term capital management, but they covered over that, and since then it grew to a point where it did implode in 2008, and it actually did kill the system. But they covered it up so that they could get this new system in place. So that's a big part of Deutsche Bank. 80% of the derivative contracts, according to the banking system and the Bank for International Settlements and all these guys, 80% of those derivative bets, which when I saw it and counted before they changed the accounting rules and created all these ways to make it look smaller, I counted 1.48 quadrillion in derivatives. 80% of those are related to interest rates, okay? The interest rates that they're related to go to what are called IBORs, which stand for interbank, IB, interbank offer rate. That is the interest rate that a bank would charge another bank to borrow overnight. Okay. Now, that was a very, very active market. And since money is created by debt, that was a tool that the banks used to create more money in the system, loaning money to each other overnight, rapidly. But all confidence in banks lost confidence in other banks because, frankly, they know they're insolvent. Banks know what's going on. They don't tell you, but they know what's going on. So they stopped lending to each other in 2008. And that means that the whole system that 80% of these derivative bets are based on died. And from that time to this time, They have simply been a stated rate, an opinion rate. That's why, now remember, in 2008, the system died. In 2009, it came to the attention of the global bankers that the IBOR rates were being manipulated. Well, guess what? If what I have to give you is my opinion, I can say any darn thing I want. So if a trader over at, one bank placed a bet and wanted to make money, he just called his buddy at the other bank and said, hey, I need the IBOR or the LIBOR rate. The L in front of it stands for London, because that's where most of them were done. But I need this rate to hit a certain level. Okay, and then seriously, they would do that for a lunch out or a pizza, or because it was a game to them, and they were making a ton of money off of it. The problem is that all the credit cards, the mortgages, the auto loans, the student loans, all those derivative bets, there is a tremendous amount of contracts that are written tied to the LIBOR. And so it came to their attention in 2009, but it did not come to public attention until 2012. And it wasn't because anybody stood out there and announced it. It was a leak. Otherwise, we still might not know about it, which means they made a mistake. And I just want you to hold that in the back of your head for a second. So the scandal hit in 2012, and pretty much the normal public just went, oh, ho-hum, like no big deal. But the problem comes in that it was a very big deal. It was actually the biggest scandal historically ever, monetarily, the biggest one ever. So then it got real quiet, and you never heard anything about the IBORs, any of the IBORs. And then last June, the group of 18 banks got together and decided that, I guess they were ready to proceed forward. And then in July, I'm pretty sure, I got to pull this up. I'm sorry I didn't. But I believe it was the Bank of England came out and said, okay, at the end of 2021, we will no longer be requiring the banks to state the IBOR rate, because it's just a gee, I think it should be this. It's an overtly manipulated rate. So that was last July. They gave us a date by the end of 2021. Okay, but here's the problem. Number one, they have to create that new interest rate mechanism. So in January, the Bank of England came out with a new mechanism, and so did the Federal Reserve. And there are a bunch of other central banks. I'm going to do a video on that. I haven't done it yet, but I have all the data. It just didn't quite fit yet. But so we've got two central banks that have come up with options. Okay, well, why don't we just use those? Okay, well, here's why. Because they have to now create a market for any of those mechanisms, and there'll be more that are coming out. And then you have to convert every single contract that comes due after 2021. They call it amend. I call it reset, restructure. They have to amend every single contract that comes due after that. In some cases, that's not a problem. As the ISDA, which is the self-regulatory, same group of bankers that create this mess, and it's the fox creating the hen house and watching over the hen house kind of thing. But they published a really nice paper, and I did this in the LIBOR piece, so I've got all the links to those papers, which Megan can send you as well, in there, where they really clearly showed that for retail people like mortgages, auto loans, student loans, credit cards, those kind of thing. The language to automatically reset or change the rate is built in there, so that's not a problem. Also, if it is a bilateral or trilateral trade, which would be derivatives, so either between two entities or three entities, that's a small enough group of people that they can also probably make that change. And keep in mind, I mean, they'd have to negotiate it. They probably do it. And that is the lion's share of the derivatives that are out there are over the counter. So they're really opaque. They're really opaque. And there's no market for them. And keep that in mind. However, on a bunch of other derivative contracts that are very complex and commingled and involve a lot of parties, they have to get 100% agreement. 100%. Well, if everything is in your favor and the shift would mean that that's no longer the case, are you going to agree to it?
No.
I mean, you get three people in a room and you can have an argument, right? So, and if they don't get 100% of the people to agree to it over here, it doesn't matter if everybody else has agreed to it. There's no agreement. And so the system has to reset. It has to reset. And people think, because I don't often read the comments in there. They kind of like to protect me from them because I'm so busy researching and doing this stuff anyway. But they, Eric made mention that a lot of people are saying, oh, she said 2021. She said 20. The only reason why I said 2021 is because the Bank of England or whoever that regulatory body was, and I'll get that to you, said it will be over by 2021. That means between now and then, when they have to attempt to reset all of those contracts, that could very well push us into a position that cannot be hidden. It cannot be hidden. That means the stock market would crash, the bond market would implode, and we've already, in a rising interest rate environment, and then the real estate market is pretty iffy at this juncture anyway. But it's, so basically what I'm saying is that according to the powers that are running this boat, by the end of 2021, if every contract has not been converted or reset, then, it's going to end in 2021. But I think it'll happen before that, actually. Because remember how I said before, keep in mind that they made a mistake and the scandal erupted? Okay, well, we all know how many fines the banks have been paying. Deutsche Bank alone, first of all, 52% of their debt comes due after 2021. Okay, and in addition to that, they have something like 7,000 regulatory filings against them, which doesn't mean that they made 7,000 mistakes. It means they got caught 7,000 times. And they've already settled them. If you get caught, doesn't that mean that you made a mistake?
Yeah.
So we do not really know all of the full garbage that's going on in the financial system because it hasn't been brought to our attention by some kind of explosion or leak or what have you. But every time we report a new scandal, that somebody made a stupid move and they got caught. So expecting them to make this transition absolutely perfectly, and even if they do, and this is all according to those documents that I referred to, so none of this is me saying it, these are the things that they're looking at. If you have a contract, every contract must be valued at market, and the way that it's valued at market is attached to, in interest rate contracts, is tied to the interest rate. So if you calculate the interest rate this way, and now all of a sudden you're calculating the interest rate this way, the value of those contracts will be different. Now, the value of those contracts are all on these insolvent banks' books at a certain level that they have manipulated it to.
Yeah.
But it's at a certain level, right? What happens when that changes? You're going to be able to hide the insolvency? I don't think so. So that's why LIBOR is that critically important, because that could easily, and I'm I could be wrong, certainly. I mean, these are things that are not within my control. But the reality is I could easily see how that would create a derivative event that they couldn't hide. And frankly, maybe they don't want to hide any of this stuff anymore. Because as you so aptly pointed out, and I've seen in many, many studies, a crisis is a way to move an agenda forward.
Yeah. And then that's what will probably happen one way or another. So that leads me to a couple of these questions that I've been sent. Firstly, it's going to affect everyone, as people's mortgages and things. So say someone's got a mortgage, what's going to happen? Maybe before I even get to that, to the question, what's going to happen to somebody's mortgage, say?
Well, what typically happens, and it's interesting because I just did a video on that. That was part 3, what happens to contracts. And I had pulled all this historical data to do it on. And that's when I actually came across all that information on the LIBOR. So what typically happens, and they're saying it in these documents, is that if you have any debt that you have that's variable rate, so that's credit cards, but it can also be a mortgage. If you're on variable rate, then that interest rate's going to start spiking sooner. And they probably also, even though you think that it's capped, you need to read the language of your contract. And if it says that they can comply with Basel III, they're going to restructure it. The language is in your contracts, whether you realize it or you don't. If you have a fixed rate mortgage, they can't do it that quickly. So on average, about 9 months after a planned reset, so Venezuela's planned reset was on February 5th, okay? So just this past February 5th, so I'm counting down to see if they're going to hold true. Then they reset the mortgages based on that planned reset. And you get a letter from the bank that says you either pay off your mortgage by X date, or your new principal is going to be X, and your new payments are going to be Y. If all you have is fiat money, you are not likely to be able to pay that mortgage off. Most people don't have a 200,000 or 500,000 or whatever the balance of your mortgage is. Most people don't have that in cash sitting there. So everything will reset, and then most people won't be able to comply. So there's a lot of property that comes onto the market. And if you have gold, though, you will be able to comply. You will simply convert however much gold you need to into those dollars for that minute, and bam, bam, you pay off your mortgage. Exactly the same strategy of governments. The other thing that happens to property are real estate taxes. Now, I don't know if you have, do you have real estate taxes in New Zealand? I don't know this.
Yeah, there are some, yeah.
So typically the other piece of that, even if you have your mortgage paid off, your real estate is in jeopardy through the real estate taxation, and they call that immovable property, and have said we are not doing enough to take advantage of immovable property. So your taxes go up. If you can't pay your taxes, then you're going to lose the property. So you can protect that, the ability to always pay that, with barterable gold. Okay. So that's what happens to mortgages and property during a hyperinflationary event. They get very cheap, though, too, for those that have the ability to take advantage of it.
Yes, but that brings me to this first question, because is it actually going to be like that? Because I think the bankers and those in control, they actually want they want everything, ultimately. In the end, it's not maybe about way it's always been. It's like they want control of everything. So Diana from Texas said, in information's being presented, generally, that you should physically hold gold and silver so that after the reset you'll have increased ability to purchase what you need and want. Sort of a hedge against the collapse, like everything will still be here like it was in 2008. And you can use your gold and silver to buy, your gold to buy a nice house that was foreclosed upon, or a city block maybe. I'm thinking things aren't going to go that well, that we'll need gold and silver just to buy food and water, etc., just to survive. And what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that when the whole crisis hits, we're going to get very, very local for a minute. So anything, any talent that you possess, anything physical that you possess is barterable. Silver is universally barterable. I can go anywhere with my silver or my gold, and instantly I can convert it into any currency or any good or any service. So I like personally to sustain your standard of living as we are going through this reset, then you definitely need a certain level of barterable silver and gold, which, by the way, I'm going to film it on Monday. I'm going to show everybody all the different kinds of gold and silver and talk about the function of each. So I'm going to do that next week.
Cool. Okay, so Renee, also from Texas, she said to ask you, she said, is it better to buy gold or silver right now if you have about 5 to 7K to spend? And also, if banks and credit unions will fare the same under the reset, or is a credit union safer?
Well, a credit union or even a small local bank is not really safer, simply because they depend on the commercial banks. So whatever, and we saw in 2008 that, it was really the smaller banks that went out. So I don't really think, no, if it's in the system, it's in the system, and everything is going to anything that's in the system is going to stay there, even if you have a statement that says otherwise. So it is better. Yes, I mean, you start to accumulate. My personal mantra, and one that I've been building for a while, food, which is the biggest issue during hyperinflation. And then meds are the second biggest issue. So it's food, water, energy, security, barterability, wealth preservation. You can do both those things with gold and silver, but barterable you can do with other stuff too. I mean, toilet paper, alcohol, okay? And then community, because we're going to have to get through this together. And I mean, I buy all the time, and I've been accumulating for a long time. Here what we do and what I did, thanks to New Zealand, because that was just a small window where you could do those non-dollar denominated bonds. So I know I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But, really, thanks to that, you can see repeatable patterns. And I developed a strategy for myself based upon those repeatable patterns and what I wanted to accomplish for my children and my grandchildren. When I came to ITM in 2002, the first two things I did was I built the infrastructure to track all of the different asset classes. And then I also built the infrastructure so that everybody is actually executing the same strategy that I'm executing, just tweaked for them. And thank goodness I did both those things when I first got here, because I'd never have the time to do it now. There's no way. And that's what we specialize in. I mean, here we're all about physical gold and silver, but really, for any of your listeners, call and talk to one of our precious metals consultants, and let's look at what your circumstances are, what your goals are, what you have to work with, and develop your own strategy that supports that. And that's really the answer. But gold and silver here are ridiculously undervalued. So yeah, you want to have most of your wealth in an undervalued circumstance. This is your wealth insurance.
So what would you, if you had, 5K, Would you put it into gold or would you put it into silver?
I would do both. Absolutely, I would do both.
Right. So then the third question is, well, I say it's one of our listeners. It's actually part of he's a guy who's part of our Minute to Midnight team. And he said to me to ask you, what would stop governments from changing the rules and confiscating all gold and silver?
Well, actually, desperate governments do desperate things. And I personally, I've done a study on the laws, and you'll see this in part 4 too. But I did it a long time ago. I'm updating it. I did a study of the laws on the books pertaining to gold and their ability to confiscate. And they're all still on the books, and they go all the way back to 1913. So, and we even recent, India, Venezuela, we are seeing confiscation. But what they have a tendency to confiscate are the pieces that are more common. And the hesitancy that you hear in my voice when I say that is because gold and silver, since it's physical, there's a finite amount of it. But the new stuff it makes up 98%, 99% of the total gold market. And that would be, anything that was minted probably after 1986. So that's what they have a tendency to more go after. So therefore, what I personally do for myself is I buy collectible gold. I'm not so concerned about a confiscation of silver because it'd be too complicated for them to attempt to confiscate since it gets used up in manufacturing and in industry. But gold is not. It's recoverable. That's why it's the primary currency metal and silver's the secondary. So, with gold, I personally, now this has not always been true, and I'll tell you a funny story about that actually, but I personally don't own any new stuff, new gold, no bullion at all. I only do the collectibles because I want my gold to be in the category of the guys that write the laws. Because when they change those laws or they come out with them, that impacts the masses, and I want to be on the team that's going to write the laws. So that's why I personally only do collectible gold. And like I said, we're going to do on Monday, we're going to record it so we run it when I'm in New York. But, I said I'm going to show you all the different kinds of gold. We actually had to order in bullion because nobody here had any examples that I could show. Well, because we're immersed in this.
Yeah.
We're always studying and reading and paying attention, all of us. We are a team here. So we put out a call and we said, okay, everybody, and nobody had any bullion. Nobody had any bullion.
That's interesting.
So,
very
isn't that interesting?
It is, yes. And I know for a lot of people, those of us, well, like myself, that doesn't have much money, that silver is still cheap enough, that I think pretty much most people should be able to afford to at least accumulate a little bit, even if it is only a little bit, slowly at a time,
right.
Whereas gold is much harder for people that don't have.
Except that gold and silver in any form is monetary at its base. So if you have Aunt Bessie's sterling silver fork, even if it's bent and broken, it's still 92.5% pure.
Yeah.
Okay. 14 karat gold is 58% pure. 18 karat gold is 75% pure. So there are so many different ways that you can approach this market depending upon what your circumstances are. And you can also buy fractional gold coins. Okay, so like a French franc which is about 1/5 of an ounce of gold, is probably, I don't know in terms of the Aussie, I'd have to look that up, or New Zealand dollar, but like from us, it's probably somewhere around $300. So that's what you said. Well, if I'm coming in with 5 to 700, do both because you can, right? So there's different ways where you can accumulate both. For me, silver is more about barterability. Gold is about wealth preservation. And that's why you have to be diversified in both of those. But there are ways to do it for very little money. Yard sales, antiques, you go to antique stores. A lot of the dealers don't really understand if they have something that's broken and battered and they think it's junk, but they don't throw it out because it's sterling silver. You go in and say, hey, I'll pay you spot for it by weight, by content weight. And they're like, rock and roll, yeah. Because if they take it to a smelter, they're going to get less than that.
Right.
Right? So there are all different ways. You just have to be a little creative and look.
That's very good points. I think that, you started with the food and water and all of that. That's obviously got to come first and foremost. Unfortunately, I've heard horror stories about people that have been, told the financial system was going to fall over tomorrow. The sky's falling down tomorrow and you've got to get all your money out of the bank and buy gold and silver. And they basically did that and ended up with big tax bills and different things. And, they overshot it because they'd been scared into, which I think is wrong. But,
right.
It's kind of something we've got to do over a period of time. But starting off with your basic necessities has got to come first, doesn't it?
Well, it's got, the way that I did it for myself was in all of those areas, I took a look and I said, okay, where do I feel the most vulnerable? And then I did some work in that area that helped me feel better. And I'd say, okay, where do I feel the most vulnerable? And so, a lot of people kind of have this all or nothing mentality where I think, no, you got to get started because what silver and gold do is they are universal. So no matter where you are or what you're doing, you can utilize it. But I, again, I think you need to approach it in a diversified way. I'll work on the food a little bit and then I'll work on the security a little bit. And, although I consistently do buy gold and silver, but I'm just finishing up my pond right now. So I'm at the very last stages of it. I can't wait till that's
been a big, long project, hasn't it? Yeah.
It's been a big, long project, but I now have better water to drink. And I have floating islands that are coming in and I have fish in there. So I'm growing food on those islands. So I have food out front that if somebody walks by, they're welcome, to have some and share it. But I have food in the back. But, so you do a combination. Where do you feel most vulnerable? And don't forget toilet paper. And because that is actually quite a hot item during hyperinflation.
Yeah, I'll bet it is.
I know it sounds funny, but it's true.
And I bet coffee's another one too, that having coffee as a barterable item.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Okay, now our time's probably getting pretty much close to running out. So have you got any other sort of last thoughts and of course give us your website and where people can find these videos that you're making and different things. But have you got any other thoughts that you would want our listeners to take away from this that you think's important?
Well, boy, I think we covered so much of the really important stuff today. So, I'll tell you where, go to our YouTube channel, ITM Trading, or you could even these days, amazingly, you can actually Google my name and it'll probably take you to to our YouTube channel. And we publish at least 2 to 3 times or more a week. I usually try and do three different things. We always have a Q&A and then a couple of what's going on with insiders and a research report. So there's always new information on that. Our website is itmtrading.com. And, really, we are different because we really actually help you develop a strategy, and we're there all along the way. The intention of all of our work is to be with you through this entire trend cycle till we get to the other side of the cycle. And then probably after that, but that's really the piece that I'm looking at, right now. But diversify and really just look at your circumstance. Where do you feel the most vulnerable, and start working on that, and then just go to the next area and the next area and the next area. But honestly, don't wait.
Yeah.
We're at the end of this phase, and I think the central banks are out of ammunition. I mean, I don't think they can. I'm sure there's going to be another QE, but confidence is bad. And in any Ponzi scheme, it requires confidence. And the system's dead. So don't wait too long. Don't wait too long. I'd rather be 2 weeks too early or 2 years too early than even 1 minute too late. Personally, I don't own any stocks or bonds or annuities or any of that fiat money product, but you do need cash as well. That's your first line of defense, even though it's going to worthless. Doesn't matter. You'll make it up. So, yeah.
Excellent. Good advice. Well, thank you, Lynette, for being on the Minute to Midnight show today. We have covered a lot of stuff. Hopefully, the listeners will be able to follow it and even go back and listen a second time to take in some of it if necessary. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've learned something out of it, and hopefully everyone will have.
I need to come to New Zealand. I really want to do that.
You do. You should. Like I say.
Yeah, well, maybe there's going to be a symposium there that I can get on the panel, and that'll get me there.
Yeah. Oh, well, good luck. Hopefully it'll work out for you. So, thanks, and we'll have to have you come back on again.
I'd love it.
Excellent.
Be safe out there.
Folks, the Minute to Midnight show is run 100% by donations. I want to say thank you to the small number of people that do donate to us, and also to ask if anyone else is able to help us out. That'd be great. We'd really appreciate it. And you can find ways to donate to us on our website. And you can find all of the A Minute to Midnight shows on our website, aminutetomidnight.com. And we put articles on the website as well as our shows. And you can find the shows on iTunes and on YouTube as well. I write, play and record all the music that's in our shows. And you can find some free music on the A Minute to Midnight website for download as well. I hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back with another episode in a few days' time. Until then, God bless and have a great and safe week.